Ever notice how some people are just naturally left-handed? Like, it's no big deal, they just use their left hand for everything. It always makes me wonder what makes us the way we are. Today, we're taking a deep dive into a study that really challenges the traditional thinking on handedness.
Yeah, it's one of those classic debates, right? Nature versus nurture. Is it in our genes, or does the environment shape us more than we realize? This study really dives deep into the genetics side of the equation.
And they make a really interesting point about some of the previous research. A lot of those studies used which hand people write with as the main way to determine handedness, but
Right, because we learn to write. So it's not necessarily the most reliable indicator of what comes naturally to us. I mean, imagine if you grew up somewhere that discouraged left-handed writing. You might be labeled as right-handed just based on what you're taught, not on what your genes were sort of predisposing you towards.
it's almost like a cultural bias creeping in and skewing the results.
Exactly. And that's why this study used a more comprehensive definition, one that considers a whole bunch of different activities, not just writing, like throwing a ball, using tools, things like that. It's about getting a more complete picture of someone's inherent handedness.
It makes you think twice about those lefty labels, doesn't it? So how does this study actually connect handedness to our genes?
Well, they proposed this really intriguing idea. A single gene, they call it the RGHT gene, that could hold the key to why some of us are right-handed.
Okay, hold on. I have to stop you right there. One gene. How can just one gene have that much influence on something as complex as which hand we prefer?
It's actually a pretty elegant model when you break it down. So picture this. We all inherit two copies of this gene, one from mom, one from dad, and each copy can come in two different flavors. One flavor, let's call it the R flavor, is like the dominant spice in a recipe, the one that really packs a punch. If you inherit even one R, you're almost certainly going to be right-handed.
So that R is like the right-handedness promoter.
Exactly. Now, the other flavor, let's call it R, is a little more subtle. If you inherit two of those R flavors, it's kind of a toss-up whether you'll be right or left-handed. It's like a coin flip, basically a 50-50 chance.
So that explains how some people end up left-handed, even with this so-called right-handedness gene in the mix. It all depends on which combination you inherit, right?
You've got it. But what's even wilder is this other piece of evidence they found. They discovered this fascinating link between your dominant hand and get this, the direction your hair whirls.
Wait. Back up a second. You're telling me there's a connection between which hand I use and which way my hair swirls on top of my head. That sounds crazy.
It's definitely one of those things that makes you go, huh, who knew? But it's not totally out of the blue. There was this study back in 1975 by Wunderlich and Hirama. They found something similar.
Really?
Yeah. They were looking at newborns and noticed this pattern. The vast majority of right-handed babies, something like 92%, had clockwise hair whorls.
Oh, wow. So, like, if you were to trace the direction of their hair, it would be going the same way as a clock's hand.
You got it. But here's the really interesting part. When they looked at non-right-handed babies, it was almost a perfect split. Like 50% clockwise, 50% counterclockwise.
That's such a huge difference. How could that be just a coincidence?
That's the million-dollar question. And the study suggests that this weird little connection might actually be more evidence for that whole single gene theory we were talking about. It's like if you have one single gene influencing both handedness and the hair whirl direction, that could be why we see this pattern.
I see what you mean. It starts to make a bit more sense if you think of it that way. But what about identical twins? Doesn't that whole thing kind of throw a wrench in the whole genes determine handedness theory?
You mean those cases where you have identical twins, same DNA and all, but one's a lefty and one's a righty?
Exactly. How can you explain that if it's all about genes?
It's a great point, and it's something a lot of people bring up. This study actually addressed that directly. They looked at the children of those discordant twin pairs, the ones where one twin is right-handed, the other isn't.
So they're looking at the next generation to see if there's any kind of pattern.
Yep. Remember how we were talking about that R flavor of the gene? The one that's kind of a wild card? Well, the study suggests that these discordant twins probably both have two copies of that R flavor, meaning their own handedness was basically a coin flip. So if that's true, what would you expect to see in their kids?
Let me think. If their handedness was a coin flip, then their kids would have like a 50-50 chance of being right-handed or not, right? Really?
Yeah, exactly. And guess what? That's pretty much exactly what they found. They compared the handedness of kids from families where both parents were right-handed to kids from these discordant twin families. Turns out, almost 17% of the kids from the discordant twin families ended up being non-right-handed.
And that lines up with their genetic model.
Perfectly. 17% is remarkably close to what their model predicted it should be, about 19.5%. Plus, it's way different from the percentage you'd expect if it was all down to environmental factors. So it really throws a wrench in that whole idea that those lefty twins are just a product of their environment.
That is pretty compelling evidence, but this whole hair whirl thing is still kind of blowing my mind. Is there really a solid connection there, or could it just be a fluke?
Well, it's definitely one of the stranger findings, and not every study has found such a strong link. It seems like the way you measure handedness and hair whorl direction can sometimes make a difference, but the fact that multiple studies have noticed this connection, even if it's not always super strong, is pretty hard to ignore.
So it's more than just a quirky correlation then, this hair whirl thing. It could actually tell us something important about how handedness works on a genetic level.
Yeah, it's like a whole new window into how we develop as humans. And it gets even more interesting when you start thinking about the bigger picture. We've been talking about how this RGHT gene might determine which side of the brain takes the lead in things like language.
Right, like for most right-handed people, it's the left side of the brain that handles language.
Exactly. But here's where it gets really wild. This study suggests there might be totally separate genetic pathways for things that develop with left-right asymmetry in the nervous system, like handedness, versus things that develop with that asymmetry in your internal organs.
Wait, hold on. Two completely different systems in the body. What makes them think there's a connection between how those systems develop?
Well, think about it. Most of us have our heart on the left, our liver on the right. Our organs have this very specific, consistent asymmetry.
Right, but that doesn't seem to have anything to do with whether we're right or left-handed.
Exactly, and that's what's so interesting. It suggests that there might be a whole different set of genetic instructions that dictate how our insides are organized, completely separate from the ones that influence handedness, like two different blueprints working at the same time.
Wow, that's incredible. Two different blueprints. So this study isn't just about why some people are left-handed. It's suggesting there's this whole other layer of complexity to how our bodies develop asymmetrically in the first place.
Right, and it really makes you think. If something as seemingly simple as handedness is hardwired into our genes, should we be approaching things differently? I'm talking about everything from how we design tools to how we teach kids in school.
It's like we've built a whole world that favors right-handedness, when really there's this natural variation that we haven't really accounted for.
Exactly. There's a growing movement to create more inclusive environments for both left and right-handed people. It's about time we started challenging those old assumptions and embracing these differences.
I love that. It's amazing how something as simple as which hand we prefer can tell us so much about our genetics, our brains, even our culture. This has been a fascinating deep dive. Any final thoughts for our listeners, something to ponder as they go about their day?
Well, this study makes a strong argument that our genes play the main role in determining handedness, but it also acknowledges that the environment can still have an influence. So here's something to think about. If our genes lay the foundation, how much does our environment shape how that handedness actually plays out in our lives? It's a question worth considering.
It really is. And on that note, we'll leave you to ponder that. This has been an incredible journey, and as always, thanks for joining us.